A billionaire father, broken by the loss of his wife and desperate for help, fired 7 different nannies in less than a year, because none of them could handle the challenges of his autistic baby boy, until one ordinary day when the new maid he had hired simply to clean the house got down on her knees, reached out her hands, and gently encouraged the child to walk, and against all odds, the baby took his first real steps straight into her arms. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Hale arrived home later than usual that evening, his shoulders heavy from another long day at the company. He expected silence in the house, the same quiet that had followed him since the death of his wife. The mansion always felt empty, despite the presence of his staff. But that day, something different caught his attention. In the living room, instead of the usual order and formality, he saw Maria, the new employee, kneeling on the carpet with open arms. In front of her was Oliver, his baby boy, wobbling uncertainly on his small legs. Richard froze for a moment at the door, unsure of what he was seeing. Maria's face was calm but full of determination as she encouraged the child to take one more step forward. Her voice was gentle, not demanding but steady, repeating the same word again and again. "Come on, Oliver." The baby leaned forward, his arms stretched out, his body trembling with the effort of trying something new. Richard's first instinct was to intervene, to tell her that it was pointless. Oliver never responded, never tried. Yet something in the room stopped him. For the first time, he did not interrupt. He simply stood there, watching his son and the new nanny facing a challenge together. Richard's thoughts swirled as he watched the scene. He remembered the 7 nannies before Maria, all of them leaving in frustration or being dismissed by him. None of them had lasted because none had shown him what he wanted. A miracle, a replacement for his late wife, someone who could fill the gap left behind. Each woman had tried, and each had failed to connect with Oliver in a way that Richard deemed good enough. The guilt of his wife's absence weighed on him every day, and with every new nanny, he grew harsher, more impatient. But as he saw Maria's persistence, something unsettled him. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't rushing or panicking under pressure. She was simply focused on Oliver, treating him not as a problem to be fixed, but as a child learning at his own pace. Richard found himself holding his breath. Oliver's small face tightened with concentration as he took a shaky step. Then he fell forward into Maria's arms. She didn't look disappointed. She smiled, clapped softly, and whispered encouragement into his ear. Richard, still standing at the doorway, felt emotions stirring that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. The housekeeper in the corner glanced at Richard as if to warn him not to disrupt what was happening, but Richard could not move anyway. He remembered his wife holding Oliver as a newborn, whispering promises of how she would see him grow, walk, and speak. That dream had been shattered too soon, leaving Richard desperate to fulfill it alone. Yet he had failed again and again. His power and money could build companies, control markets, and buy anything in the world, but they could not make Oliver speak a word or take a step. Watching Maria now, Richard realized how deeply he had tied his son's progress to the memory of his wife. Every setback felt like another proof that Oliver was destined to live in silence, and that Richard himself was incapable of guiding him. Still, Maria's way of clapping after a failed step and speaking softly to the baby challenged his certainty. Maybe patience mattered more than success in the moment. Maybe the effort itself was a victory. Richard's chest tightened as he thought this, though he refused to admit it aloud. Maria adjusted Oliver on her lap and tried again. She set him gently back on the carpet, not showing any frustration. Oliver wobbled as he stood, his little hands opening and closing in the air, searching for balance. Richard expected him to sit down immediately, as he often did, but instead the baby shifted forward again. Maria reached her hands out, a smile fixed on her face, repeating in her steady tone, "You can do it, Oliver." The child's steps were not steady, but this time he managed 2 small movements before collapsing forward once again. Maria hugged him and celebrated as if he had run across the entire room. Richard felt something stir, something that was both relief and fear. Relief that his son might not remain locked in the same stage forever. Fear because it meant that all his harshness, his quick dismissals, his constant doubts might have been the wrong way to handle things. For the first time he wondered if the problem had never been Oliver, nor the nannies. Perhaps the problem had been him, his inability to accept imperfection, his refusal to give time and patience the space they needed. As the evening grew quieter, Richard finally walked further into the room, though he still did not say a word. He wanted to ask Maria how long she had been trying this exercise, how often she worked with Oliver, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he focused on Oliver's tiny feet pressing into the carpet, his attempts at standing again, and Maria's tireless encouragement. He noticed details he had ignored before, how Oliver's eyes followed Maria closely, how he seemed calmer in her presence, how her smile gave him confidence. These were things money could not buy. These were things he had been blind to. Richard realized that his constant search for the perfect caregiver had made him overlook the simple truth that Oliver did not need perfection. He needed someone present, patient, and willing to try without fear of failure. Maria, without knowing, was showing Richard the difference between control and care. It was something he had not been able to provide since his wife's death. Richard's chest rose and fell heavily as he finally sat down in the armchair across the room. He did not interfere, but he stayed close enough to watch everything. Oliver tried again, falling and rising, failing and trying again, always welcomed into Maria's arms. Each attempt carried a small victory, even if it ended in collapse. Richard felt a weight inside him shift. He had spent months building walls, protecting himself from disappointment, firing anyone who reminded him of failure. Yet Maria's calm persistence tore through those walls in a way he could not resist. He did not know what this meant for the future, but in that moment, the silence that had haunted his home felt less heavy. Watching Oliver reach again for Maria, Richard understood that something was changing. Slowly, painfully, but certainly, there was progress. And for the first time since his wife's death, Richard allowed himself to hope, even if only a little, as he watched Maria kneeling on the floor, guiding his son forward, one step at a time. Richard entered the living room and stopped the moment he saw Maria on the carpet with Oliver. At first, he stayed silent, just watching her hold her arms open and call softly to the baby. But his expression quickly hardened. To him, this scene felt wrong. She was not hired to play these kinds of roles. Her job was simple, to keep the house clean, to organize things, and to follow instructions. Yet here she was, sitting on the floor, encouraging his son to walk as if she were his mother. Richard's chest tightened, and his face grew red. He stepped forward sharply, his voice cold and louder than he had intended. He demanded to know what she thought she was doing. Maria froze, her hands still stretched toward Oliver, who immediately sat down on the floor when he heard his father's tone. Richard pointed to her and reminded her that her role in the house had nothing to do with Oliver's upbringing. She was there to take care of chores, not to cross lines. His words came fast and harsh, almost like accusations, making clear that she had disrespected boundaries that were not hers to touch. Maria lowered her head, her face flushing with embarrassment. She tried to speak, her voice uncertain, almost apologetic. She explained that Oliver had been crying for a long time, and she couldn't simply stand by and ignore him. She had only wanted to calm him down and give him a small distraction. Her words carried no defiance, only discomfort, as if she knew she had stepped into dangerous territory. She tried to explain further, saying that she noticed Oliver trying to pull himself up, so she thought it might be good to encourage him. Richard, however, did not soften. He kept his stance firm, his eyes sharp, reminding her once again that she was not hired to involve herself in his son's development. His tone made it clear. To him, her actions were not kindness, but interference. Maria, now visibly nervous, nodded quickly and lowered her gaze to the floor, almost shrinking under the weight of his anger. The room grew tense, and Oliver, confused by the sudden shift in energy, pressed closer to her leg, but stayed silent. Richard turned away as if to end the discussion, but he could not shake the image from his mind. Even as he tried to focus on work papers sitting on the table nearby, his thoughts replayed what he had witnessed just moments earlier. Oliver had moved toward Maria with a determination Richard had never seen before. The child's small arms had stretched out in her direction, his face showing a trust and focus that he had never shown to anyone else, not even to Richard himself. That sight had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. His anger was easier to show than his confusion. If he admitted what he saw, it would mean accepting that Maria had succeeded where he had failed. That idea was intolerable to him. Instead, he forced himself to remain distant, convinced that maintaining control was the only way to keep order in his household. Still, his thoughts betrayed him, circling back again and again to the image of Oliver's trembling steps. Maria, meanwhile, kept her hands busy with meaningless tasks to avoid the silence pressing on the room. She picked up toys scattered on the carpet, folded a small blanket, and avoided eye contact with Richard. She felt embarrassed, but at the same time, she couldn't ignore the memory of Oliver's effort. For her, the child's attempt to walk had been more than just a small exercise. It was a moment of progress, something that showed potential for growth if handled with patience. She wanted to tell Richard this, to explain that it had not been about crossing lines, but about responding to the child's needs. Yet she held her tongue, realizing that nothing she said now would make him see her intentions differently. Instead, she accepted his cold reaction in silence, even as she carried guilt for possibly making her position in the house unstable. She feared that, like others before her, she might soon be dismissed. Richard finally sat down in his chair, trying to bury himself in papers, but he kept hearing Oliver's soft whimpering sounds. The baby wasn't crying anymore, but he had crawled back toward Maria's side, pressing against her as if seeking protection. Richard's chest tightened again at the sight. He did not understand why Oliver responded to her in ways he never responded to him. He told himself it was temporary, that it meant nothing, but the thought wouldn't leave him. His mind flashed back to the moment Maria had clapped her hands gently for Oliver's effort. He remembered the way Oliver's eyes lit up, even for just a second. No matter how much Richard tried to convince himself that Maria was wrong to step in, deep inside he couldn't ignore what he had seen. He closed his eyes, pressing his hand against his forehead, pretending to be tired, but in truth, he was fighting with emotions he didn't want to face. The room stayed heavy with silence, broken only by the soft sounds Oliver made as he played near Maria. Richard avoided looking at them, yet every time his eyes shifted, he caught the same sight, his son showing a kind of trust that had been absent for so long. It was a trust Richard had never been able to inspire. He tried to harden himself, to hold on to the belief that Maria had gone too far and must be corrected, but the image of Oliver's small steps toward her kept returning. For Richard, this was not just about an employee stepping out of line. It was about something deeper, something that shook the certainty he had built around himself since his wife's death. And even as he forced himself to stay distant and cold, deep inside, he knew the truth. Maria had reached Oliver in a way no one else had. He could deny it to her face, but he could not erase it from his mind. Maria had already made up her mind. After the incident with Richard, she decided she would not stay in the house any longer than necessary. She informed him calmly that she would finish her notice period and then leave once he found another worker to replace her. Richard did not argue. He simply nodded, his usual coldness showing no change. Still, it would take a few days until another employee could be hired. During this time, Maria continued to perform her duties, keeping herself quiet and avoiding unnecessary conversation. But Oliver's presence made it hard for her to keep distance. Each evening, when the house grew quieter and Richard retreated to his office, Oliver became restless. He would cry, toss around in his crib, and refuse to settle down. Maria could not ignore it. Even if she was no longer planning to stay, she felt responsible for the child. One night, almost instinctively, she picked him up, sat in a rocking chair, and began to hum a simple tune from her childhood. The sound was soft, repeating the same pattern again and again. To her surprise, Oliver's breathing slowed, and his small body relaxed in her arms. It was the first time she had seen him calm so quickly. From that night on, Maria repeated the routine. After finishing her chores, she would wait until Oliver grew restless, then carry him gently, humming the same gentle melody. She sang no words, just a smooth, steady sound, as if her voice alone carried enough comfort. Oliver began to respond almost immediately. His eyes would blink slowly, his tiny fists unclenching as he listened. Within minutes, he would relax against her chest and drift into sleep. For Maria, it became a moment of quiet connection, something that helped her forget the tension of the house. She did not expect anyone to notice, but what she did not realize was that Richard had begun to pause outside the nursery door. The first time he heard the melody, he had stopped only out of curiosity. He had never heard Maria sing, and he wondered why she was in Oliver's room so long. But when he leaned quietly near the door, he felt something unexpected. The gentle sound filled the hallway in a way the house hadn't felt in months. He stayed longer than he intended, listening silently while Maria's soft voice carried Oliver into sleep. Richard told himself it was only coincidence, but the next night he found himself returning to the same spot outside the door. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, listening to the steady melody. The sound was not professional or trained, yet it carried a certain warmth that unsettled him. Inside the room, he heard Oliver's cries fade, replaced by calm breaths. For a man used to controlling everything with strict rules and money, this simple act seemed almost unbelievable. He remembered countless nights when Oliver had refused to settle, when he had called nannies, doctors, and even specialists to explain why his son would not sleep peacefully. None of their advice had worked. Yet here was Maria, a woman he had nearly dismissed, calming the boy with nothing more than a song. Richard did not step inside. He remained at the door, never revealing his presence, but he could not deny the effect the routine had on him. The emptiness of the house, which had haunted him since his wife's death, felt different while Maria sang. He still fought against the thought, but part of him knew he was beginning to look forward to those moments each night. Maria remained unaware of Richard's quiet presence. To her, she was simply doing what felt right for Oliver. She never thought of it as anything extraordinary. It was a lullaby she remembered from her own family, a song her mother used to sing when she was a child. She had no idea how much it affected both Oliver and Richard. Each evening she entered the nursery with the same calm determination, even when the day had been difficult. She carried Oliver close, swaying slightly in the rocking chair, repeating the melody until his eyelids grew heavy. She noticed small changes in him, how he began to rest his head against her shoulder more easily, how he no longer fought against sleep, how the tension in his tiny body faded. For her, these were signs of trust, proof that even if she was leaving soon, she had made a small difference. In those quiet minutes, she almost forgot her decision to leave. The room felt different, warmer, filled with something fragile, but real. She believed it belonged only to her and Oliver, never knowing that someone else shared those nights from the other side of the door. Richard, on the other hand, carried his own conflict. Every time he heard the lullaby, it stirred feelings he had tried to bury. The sound reminded him of his wife, though Maria's voice was different. It was not the same, yet it filled a similar space. The house had been silent for so long, filled only with Oliver's cries and his own harsh commands. The soft melody cut through that silence and replaced it with something gentler. Richard found himself staying longer outside the door each night, sometimes leaning against the frame, other times closing his eyes as if to let the sound reach him more deeply. He never admitted it aloud, but he needed those minutes almost as much as Oliver did. They gave him something he had lost, a sense that his home was not only a place of grief and control, but also a place where comfort could still exist. Though he tried to keep himself cold and distant during the day, at night he became an unspoken witness to Maria's quiet ritual. He began to wonder what would happen when she left, and whether the silence would return stronger than before. As the days passed, the routine continued. Maria sang, Oliver relaxed, and Richard listened. Each night played out the same, yet each time it carried new weight for Richard. He told no one about his quiet visits to the nursery door. He did not want Maria to know he was there, and he did not want to face the vulnerability that came with admitting how much he relied on those moments. Still, he could not stop himself from coming back. It was as if the melody filled not just the nursery, but the empty parts of his own life. For the first time in months, he felt the crushing silence of the house soften. He still intended to let Maria leave, convinced it was best. But deep down, he feared losing the sound that now carried him through the night. And so, without realizing it, Richard became part of the nightly ritual too. Maria singing, Oliver calming, and himself listening quietly from the doorway, absorbing a melody that seemed to bring life back into a house long overshadowed by loss. Richard was not looking for anything when he opened the small cabinet in the hallway closet. He had been searching for some household documents that the staff usually kept there, but while moving a pile of folded linens, something slipped out. A photo frame, simple and slightly worn, rested between the fabric. Curious, Richard picked it up. The picture showed Maria, much younger, standing beside a young man who clearly shared her features. The boy's eyes were distant, his smile uneven, and his hands were held tightly in front of him. Richard looked closer and recognized familiar signs, movements and expressions he had seen in Oliver. The boy in the picture was clearly autistic. Maria, however, was smiling warmly, one arm wrapped around her brother as if she had done it 1,000 times before. The image struck Richard harder than he expected. Suddenly, her patience, her calm voice, and her instinctive way of handling Oliver made sense. She was not guessing or experimenting blindly. She had lived this before for years. Standing there with the photo in his hand, Richard felt his chest tighten. For the first time, he truly understood that Maria's actions came from experience, not interference. She knew Oliver in a way no one else could. He placed the photo back carefully, but the image stayed fixed in his mind. All afternoon, Richard found himself distracted. During a meeting call, his mind drifted back to Maria's gentle tone when she encouraged Oliver. Later, when he passed the nursery, he saw her straightening toys and quietly humming as Oliver crawled around her feet. He looked at her differently now. Instead of seeing a worker crossing boundaries, he saw a sister who had once carried responsibility for someone like Oliver. He imagined the years she must have spent helping her brother, the patience it demanded, the frustration she had probably felt but never showed. It explained everything, the way she celebrated small steps, the way she never seemed to tire of repeating things, the way she remained calm when Oliver resisted. Richard realized that all the women he had hired before were professionals, but none had personal understanding. Maria did. The thought unsettled him, but also softened something inside him. For months he had told himself no one could care for Oliver like his wife had. Now he realized he had been wrong. Maria might not replace his wife, but she had qualities that made her different from anyone else who had entered this house. Later that evening, Richard stood at his office window, thinking about what to do. Normally he kept his distance from Maria, speaking only when necessary, keeping interactions short and cold. But after what he had discovered, that distance suddenly felt unnatural. He thought about his wife, about how she had once said that patience was more powerful than control when raising a child like Oliver. He realized Maria had been proving that to him for weeks, yet he had been too stubborn to see it. A decision began forming in his mind, one that felt unusual but necessary. When he finally left his office, he walked down the hallway with a slower step than usual. He found Maria in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. She looked up, surprised when he entered, expecting another short instruction or criticism. Instead, Richard paused, his usual stern expression replaced by hesitation. For the first time, he called her by her name, softly, without anger. Maria froze at the sound, shocked by the difference in his tone. She nodded politely, waiting for him to continue, unsure what this new version of him meant. Richard cleared his throat, feeling almost uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "Would you join me for tea?" he asked, his voice steady but uncharacteristically gentle. Maria blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. Never before had he invited her to sit with him. She hesitated, glancing at the table she was cleaning, but then gave a small nod. Richard motioned toward the sitting room, and they walked there together in silence. When the tea was brought by another staff member, Richard poured it himself, something Maria had never seen him do. The atmosphere felt strange to her, almost as if she had stepped into someone else's life. She sat stiffly, unsure how to act, but Richard broke the silence. He told her he had noticed the way Oliver responded to her, that her presence seemed to bring something out of him that no one else had managed. He admitted slowly and carefully that she had done more for his son than all the professionals he had hired before. Maria listened, her hands tightening around the teacup, not knowing if she should speak or remain silent. For Richard, the words were difficult to say. He had built a wall of control and authority since the day his wife passed, convincing himself that only his way was acceptable. To sit there now, admitting that someone else had succeeded where he had failed, felt both humiliating and freeing. He looked at Maria and added that he now understood her patience came from a real place. He told her, without explaining how, that he knew she had experience caring for someone like Oliver. He did not go into detail about the photo, but he let her know he had realized her strength did not come by accident. Maria lowered her gaze, her throat tightening, realizing that he must have seen the picture of her brother. She felt exposed, but also relieved. For so long she had hidden that part of her life, afraid it would be misunderstood. Now, hearing Richard speak of it with respect, she felt a mix of emotions: embarrassment, pride, and cautious trust. The conversation ended quietly. Richard did not push further, nor did he ask personal questions. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his tone softer than she had ever heard it, and repeated her name again, as if to remind her he saw her as more than an employee. "Maria," he said, "thank you." Those words, simple yet heavy, carried more meaning than any order or reprimand she had heard from him before. Maria nodded, unsure how to respond, but her chest warmed with the recognition. That night, as she returned to her room, she replayed his words again and again. Richard, on the other hand, remained in the sitting room, staring at the untouched tea, knowing that something in their relationship had shifted. For the first time, he had let his guard down, and in doing so, he had acknowledged what Maria had truly done for his son. The storm began late in the evening, shaking the windows of the house with heavy rain and loud thunder. Richard was in his office, pretending to read a document, though his attention kept drifting toward the sound of the storm. Oliver was in his room, already restless, and Maria moved quietly through the halls, checking that everything was in place. Then, without warning, the power went out. The house, usually filled with artificial light, was suddenly swallowed by darkness. Richard froze, his heart skipping as the sound of Oliver's cry broke through the silence. The baby's wail grew louder and louder, filled with fear, as he struggled to understand the sudden change around him. Richard rushed toward the nursery, but when he arrived, he stood helpless by the door. Oliver was trembling, screaming, his small hands pulling at the crib rails, his little body overwhelmed by the darkness and noise outside. Richard wanted to act, to comfort his son, but his body locked up. Every attempt he imagined seemed useless. He gripped the doorframe, his chest tight, the familiar weight of failure pressing down on him. In his mind, every cry from Oliver sounded like proof that he was not enough, that no matter what he tried, he could not reach him. Maria entered quickly, her movements calm and steady, as if the blackout had not caught her by surprise. She held a lighter in her hand and lit the first candle she found on the dresser. The warm glow softened the shadows in the room. She then placed more candles around, moving with a confidence that contrasted with Richard's paralyzed state. Once the dim light returned, she approached the crib and lifted Oliver into her arms without hesitation. She held him close, rocking him gently, her voice beginning its familiar melody. The same tune she had sung on quiet nights filled the room again, but now it carried more strength, more reassurance. Oliver's screams began to break into sobs, then into whimpers, his body slowly relaxing against her. Richard watched from the side, his fists clenched at his sides. He hated how natural it looked, how easily she had done what he could not. Yet at the same time, he felt relief flood through him. He could see Oliver calming down in Maria's arms, something that seemed impossible only moments before. The guilt inside him grew heavier, but alongside it came admiration, a recognition that he had no control here. She did. Richard moved closer, his voice shaky when he finally spoke. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, almost whispering, though the storm outside drowned nothing. Maria did not turn her head. She continued swaying with Oliver, her song never breaking. Richard lowered himself onto the chair near the crib, his eyes fixed on his son. "I keep failing him," he said, his throat tight. "Every time he needs me, I freeze. I don't know how to help him. I don't know how to be what he needs." He paused, his hand pressing against his forehead, his chest rising heavily. For so long he had hidden behind his anger, his demands, his dismissals of others. But in this moment, with thunder shaking the house and the candlelight flickering, he felt stripped of all defenses. His voice cracked as he finally said the words he had buried for so long. "I'm afraid I'll never be enough for him." It was the first time he had spoken his fear out loud, and the weight of it left him trembling. Maria finally turned her head slightly, though she did not stop rocking Oliver. She looked at Richard with calm eyes, but she said nothing. Instead, she shifted closer and sat beside him on the edge of the chair, balancing Oliver between them. The baby's breathing was calmer now, his face pressed against her shoulder, soothed by the song. Maria reached out her free hand slowly, as if giving Richard the chance to refuse. He didn't. He let her take his hand, her touch firm but warm. For a moment, Richard closed his eyes, feeling both embarrassed and relieved. He had never allowed anyone to see him so exposed, so broken. Yet Maria did not judge, did not tell him he was wrong or weak. She simply held his hand, steady and quiet, letting the silence carry more meaning than words ever could. In that moment, Richard felt something loosen inside him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to show his weakness without shame. The storm outside continued, but inside the room, the atmosphere changed. Oliver was quiet now, his body relaxed, his tiny hands no longer trembling. The candlelight flickered across the walls, casting long shadows that danced gently. Richard's hand remained in Maria's, and though no words passed between them, the silence was different this time. It was not the heavy silence of grief or guilt that had filled his house for so long. It was a silence of understanding, one that gave him room to breathe. He felt that Maria was not carrying his burden for him, but rather sharing it, reminding him that he was not alone in this struggle. Richard had spent months shutting people out, convinced that no one could understand his pain or his son's needs. Yet here was Maria, sitting beside him, showing him that his fear did not have to destroy him. He felt small, but not useless, weak, but not abandoned. For the first time, he began to believe that maybe being enough was not about never failing, it was about not giving up. As the storm began to calm outside, the room settled into stillness. Oliver had fallen asleep completely, his tiny breath soft against Maria's shoulder. She placed him gently back in the crib, pulling the blanket over him before sitting back down. Richard remained where he was, his hand still linked with hers. He did not thank her, nor did he try to explain himself further. There was no need. Maria did not speak either, understanding that words would only break the fragile honesty of the moment. In that silence, Richard felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: the relief of not having to pretend. The blackout had revealed more than the absence of electricity. It had forced him to face the truth he had buried, his fear, his limitations, and his need for help. And though he had admitted his weakness, he did not feel ashamed. With Maria's steady hand in his, he felt something new, something he thought he had lost forever. The courage to keep going, even in the dark. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that usually passed without anything special happening. Maria sat on the floor with Oliver, a few toys spread out on the carpet around them. She had learned not to push him too hard, letting him explore at his own pace, even if his movements were slower and his reactions often delayed. That day, she picked up a soft stuffed animal and gently tapped it against her head, pretending it had bumped her. She made a simple, exaggerated face and let out a playful, "Oh no!" Oliver blinked, his eyes following the toy. Maria repeated the action, this time brushing the stuffed animal against his arm before pulling it back quickly, as if it were alive. She added a small sound effect, just enough to catch his attention. Oliver's lips parted slightly, his eyes wide with curiosity. Then, almost unexpectedly, a small sound escaped him, a short, uneven giggle. Maria froze for a moment, realizing what had just happened, and then leaned closer, repeating the playful movement again. This time, the laugh came louder, fuller, and genuine. Oliver's small chest shook with his very first real laugh, and the sound filled the room like nothing she had heard before. At the doorway, Richard stood completely still, having arrived without Maria noticing. He had intended only to check if Oliver was awake, but what he saw left him rooted in place. He had never heard his son laugh. For months, all he had known were Oliver's cries, his silence, or his distant stares. The sound of laughter was something Richard had convinced himself might never come, yet here it was, raw and unforced, echoing across the nursery. His throat tightened as he watched Oliver's little face brighten with joy, his mouth open in delight, while his tiny hands waved clumsily. Richard had seen many milestones missed, words unsaid, steps delayed, but now he was witnessing something different, something far more important. This was not just progress in development. This was proof that Oliver felt safe, that he was letting himself experience joy. Richard leaned his hand against the doorframe, his chest rising heavily as he tried to process the wave of emotions hitting him all at once. For the first time in a long while, his heart swelled not with frustration or grief, but with overwhelming gratitude. Maria, still kneeling on the carpet, noticed Oliver's laughter and decided to keep the game going. She made the stuffed animal walk toward him, pausing dramatically before tickling his belly with its soft paw. Oliver squealed, the laughter spilling out again, this time louder, his little body shaking as he tried to wriggle away while still enjoying the attention. His cheeks grew red from the effort, but his eyes shone brighter than ever. Maria clapped softly and laughed with him, encouraging the joy as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She did not realize Richard was watching from the door. To her, it was just a precious moment, something to encourage and repeat gently. She had seen Oliver's struggles, his quietness, and his tendency to pull away. For him to laugh freely like this, without fear or hesitation, was nothing short of incredible. She continued playing, her movements steady but light-hearted, making sure not to overwhelm him. The room, usually quiet and heavy, now echoed with Oliver's giggles and Maria's warm encouragement. It was the kind of sound that made everything else fade away. Richard's eyes blurred slightly, though he quickly blinked back the moisture. He had spent months trying to create a home for Oliver that was organized, controlled, and disciplined. He had believed structure was the key, that strict routines and boundaries would protect his son. Yet all that effort had only made the house feel colder. Now, watching from the doorway, Richard saw the truth. What Oliver had needed was not rules or order. It was comfort, safety, and someone who made him feel secure enough to let go. Maria had given him that without even trying. She had built it through patience, kindness, and small everyday actions that Richard had overlooked. He swallowed hard, realizing how wrong he had been. This laugh was not only Oliver's, it was Maria's victory too. She had opened a door Richard could not even find. And for the first time, instead of resisting the thought, he embraced it. He stepped further into the room, his steps slow and deliberate, still afraid to interrupt the moment, but no longer able to stay away. Maria finally looked up and noticed him. She straightened a little, unsure how long he had been there. For a brief moment she thought he might scold her again for crossing invisible lines, but his face was different this time. There was no coldness, no anger. His features were soft, almost fragile, his eyes locked on Oliver, who was still laughing as he hugged the stuffed animal tightly. Richard walked closer, lowering himself onto the edge of the armchair nearby. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together, and let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, Maria," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The sincerity in his tone startled her. It was not the distant, formal thanks of an employer. It was genuine, raw, carrying the weight of a man who had just witnessed something priceless. Maria nodded, unsure what to say, but her eyes softened, understanding what he meant without needing more words. For Richard, that moment changed everything. He realized that laughter had done what nothing else could. It had broken the silence that had haunted his home since his wife's passing. Oliver's laugh was proof that the boy could feel joy, and it was proof that Maria had created an environment where joy could exist again. Richard looked at her and finally understood. What was missing in his house was not discipline, not order, not perfection. It was the sense of protection and comfort that Maria had brought back. For the first time, he let himself accept it openly. The man who had once been consumed by control and fear now bowed his head slightly, humbled, grateful, and deeply moved. Oliver's laugh continued to echo softly in the background, and Richard knew he would never forget this day. It was not just the first laugh of his son, it was also the first time he truly saw the home begin to heal. Maria sat in her small room, staring at the letter in her hands. It was an official offer from a specialized school for children with autism, the kind of place she had once dreamed of working in. For years, she had wanted to dedicate herself to helping children like her brother, and now the opportunity was real. The school had reached out, after hearing about her experience and compassion, offering her a stable position with a clear purpose. She felt both joy and guilt as she read the words again and again. The thought of leaving Oliver behind weighed on her heart, but she also knew that the job could mean a chance to fulfill her long-held dream. Unsure of how to handle the situation, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside a drawer. She chose not to tell Richard, at least not yet. Around him she acted as usual, but her mind was constantly pulled back to the decision she would eventually have to make. Each moment with Oliver became heavier, more meaningful, because she didn't know how much longer she would be there. The secret pressed on her chest, and though she tried to hide it, her silence spoke louder than she realized. Richard was not blind to the changes. He noticed the way Maria's expression sometimes grew distant, as if she was somewhere else entirely. He saw her pause while folding laundry, her eyes far away, and he caught her sighing quietly in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. She was still caring, still attentive to Oliver, but something in her manner had shifted. She smiled less, and when she did, the smile seemed tinged with sadness. Richard, however, did not ask. He kept his distance as he always did, convincing himself that it was not his place to pry. Still, the uneasiness grew in him. He'd come to rely on her presence more than he wanted to admit, and now he felt it slipping through his hands. He told himself she was probably tired, that she would recover her spirit soon, but deep inside he feared something bigger was happening. The thought of losing her unsettled him more than he could explain, but his pride and fear of vulnerability held him back from asking what was wrong. He carried the weight in silence, pretending not to notice, while every day it became harder to ignore. Then one evening, Oliver fell ill. It started with a fever that rose quickly, leaving him weak and restless. His small body trembled, and his face flushed as he whimpered in discomfort. Richard panicked, his mind racing, but Maria stepped forward immediately with calm authority. She pressed cool cloths to Oliver's forehead, measured his temperature carefully, and prepared medicine with precise hands. She stayed by his side, cradling him when he cried, whispering softly to ease his discomfort. Richard hovered nearby, but every time he tried to help, his hands shook and his voice faltered. His fear of doing something wrong made him retreat. Maria carried the situation without hesitation, taking on the full responsibility of caring for Oliver through the long night. Richard could see her exhaustion, the shadows forming under her eyes, but she never complained. She moved with the natural rhythm of someone who knew what to do, keeping Oliver safe and comforted. Watching her made Richard feel both relieved and crushed. Relieved that Oliver had someone who understood his needs, and crushed that he himself seemed useless in comparison. The house, dimly lit and heavy with worry, became a place where Maria's presence was the only steady anchor. As the hours passed, Richard's strength collapsed. While Maria stayed close to Oliver, Richard slipped into the hallway and sat against the wall, burying his face in his hands. He felt powerless, unable to bear his son's suffering and his own failures at the same time. His chest ached, his eyes burned, and finally, the tears came. He cried silently, his shoulders shaking, letting out everything he had tried so hard to hold back. The fear of losing Oliver, the fear of never being good enough, and the deeper fear of losing Maria, all mixed together inside him. He realized in that moment how much he had come to depend on her, not just for Oliver's sake, but for his own. The idea that she might one day leave felt unbearable. He stayed in the corridor, hidden in the shadows, ashamed of his weakness, but unable to stop. His breaths came unevenly as the weight of everything he had avoided admitting pressed down harder than ever. Maria eventually stepped out of the nursery to check for more medicine and found him there, slumped against the wall. At first she froze, unsure if she should disturb him. She saw the redness in his eyes, the way his hands trembled, and the heavy grief written across his face. Slowly, she walked closer, her movements quiet, and crouched beside him. She didn't speak. Words would only make him retreat again, she knew. Instead, she rested her hand gently on his shoulder, grounding him in the silence. Richard lifted his head slightly, startled to be caught in such a vulnerable state. But Maria's calm expression held no judgment. Her presence was steady, her touch firm enough to remind him he was not alone. For a moment, he wanted to ask her to stay forever, to beg her not to leave, but the words stuck in his throat. He remained silent, caught between his pride and his desperate need. Maria stayed by his side, her hand still on his shoulder, and waited. She knew Richard was fighting a battle within himself. She could sense that he wanted to speak, to let the words escape, but she also knew she could not force them. It had to come from him. Until then, she would remain present, offering her strength in silence. Inside, she carried her own struggle, the knowledge of the job offer pulling her in one direction and her bond with Oliver pulling her in another. She wanted him to say it, to admit he needed her, but she would not push. Instead, she gave him the space to gather the courage. Richard, sitting beside her in the dim hallway, felt her steady presence and realized she was waiting for him. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe asking her to stay would not be weakness, but strength. Yet he could not say it, at least not yet. The moment ended quietly, with Maria still beside him, both of them sharing the silence that carried more meaning than any words could. Richard had avoided that room for months, almost since the day of the funeral. His late wife's bedroom had remained untouched, locked in silence, holding her presence in every detail: the perfume bottles on the dresser, the folded clothes in the closet, the photographs on the nightstand. One evening, without thinking, Richard turned the handle and stepped inside. The air was heavy, carrying a familiarity that made his chest ache. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the room, as if afraid to disturb anything. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen, until he noticed a drawer slightly open. Something inside caught his attention. With trembling hands, he pulled it fully and discovered a folded envelope resting beneath a stack of papers. His name was written on it, in his wife's handwriting, delicate and firm. His breath caught in his throat. He sat down on the edge of the bed, hesitated, and then carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written before her illness had taken its final toll. Richard began to read, his eyes following every word, as if he could hear her voice once again, guiding him, speaking to him through the distance of time and loss. The letter was short, yet every sentence pierced through him. His wife wrote about Oliver, about her fears of leaving him behind too soon, and about her hopes for their son's future. She admitted her worry that Richard might try to raise Oliver alone, carrying the burden without allowing anyone else to help. She asked him not to close himself off, not to confuse strength with isolation. "Let him find love and support," she wrote, "even in people you do not expect. Do not measure his progress by what he cannot do, but by the moments of connection he finds." Richard's vision blurred as he read those words again and again. They spoke directly to the very battle he had been fighting since her death. For months he had rejected help, pushing people away, demanding perfection, trying to prove that no one could replace her. Now her words shattered the walls he had built. He pressed the paper against his chest, his hands shaking as tears ran freely down his face. For the first time, he did not resist them. He let himself grieve and let himself feel the truth of her message. He stayed in that room long after finishing the letter. Memories overwhelmed him. His wife's laughter, the way she used to hold Oliver, the plans they had once made for the future. Each image clashed with the emptiness of the present, leaving him broken yet strangely lighter. He lay down on the floor, still clutching the letter tightly in his hands, as if it were the last bridge connecting him to her. The hours passed slowly, the storm inside him slowly quieting, though the ache remained. He whispered small apologies into the silence, apologies for his mistakes, for his anger, for shutting out the very love she had asked him to allow in. Exhaustion eventually overtook him. He drifted into an uneasy sleep on the cold floor, his body curled around the letter, refusing to let it go. In the deepest part of him, something had changed. The words had broken the last defenses he had, leaving him open in a way he hadn't been since she was alive. He did not know what would come next, but he knew he could no longer pretend to be the man of stone he had tried to be. Morning arrived quietly. Maria, as always, began her routine early, tidying the house and checking on Oliver. At one point, she noticed that Richard was not in his office, nor had she seen him since the night before. Curious and slightly concerned, she walked down the hall and saw the door of the late wife's bedroom ajar. Slowly, she stepped inside. Her eyes widened when she found Richard asleep on the floor, his hand still gripping a letter as though it were his lifeline. The sight startled her, not because of where he was, but because of how vulnerable he looked. The man who always kept his posture strong and his words controlled now seemed fragile, exposed, like someone carrying more pain than he could hold. Maria stood silently, unsure whether to wake him or leave quietly. She decided to move carefully, stepping back to give him space. But as she turned toward the door, the floor creaked softly beneath her, and Richard stirred. His hand tightened around the letter, his eyes opening slowly, still heavy with exhaustion. He blinked, confused for a moment, until his gaze settled on Maria standing in the doorway. She looked at him with concern, but said nothing, ready to retreat and give him the privacy she thought he needed. Richard, however, did not let her leave. Before she could step out, his hand reached forward and caught her wrist. His grip was not forceful, but it was firm enough to stop her. Maria froze, looking down at him in surprise. For a second, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with all the unspoken things that had built over time, their shared nights with Oliver, the quiet struggles, the fears they had never fully voiced. Richard's eyes, still wet and tired, met hers. For once, there was no wall, no barrier, no attempt to appear untouchable. He was simply a man carrying his grief, his fear, and his desperate hope all at once. He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper, carrying a weight that made her heart tighten. "Stay," he murmured. The word was simple, but it carried more than any long speech could. It was not an order, not a command, but a plea. In that moment, Richard was not the billionaire, not the stern employer, not the distant father. He was only a man admitting that he needed her presence, that he did not want to face what lay ahead without her. Maria stood still, her breath caught in her throat, realizing that this was the first time he had ever spoken to her with such honesty. She nodded gently, her hand still in his, and understood that everything had changed. The letter, the grief, the silence, it had all led to this small but powerful request. Richard clutched the paper to his chest once more, but his other hand did not release her. For the first time since his wife's death, he allowed himself to lean on someone else, and in that moment, Maria knew she could not walk away. Richard had spent the entire day rehearsing the words in his head. For weeks, he had carried the fear that Maria would one day leave, and the letter from his late wife had finally stripped him of any excuses to stay silent. He could no longer deny what was clear. Maria was not just another person passing through their house. She had become essential, both to Oliver and to himself. That evening after dinner, Richard waited until the house was quiet. He found Maria in the living room, sitting on the floor with Oliver while he stacked wooden blocks clumsily. Richard's chest tightened at the sight, a mix of pride and fear twisting inside him. He stepped closer, his voice uncertain but steady enough to be heard. "Maria," he began, drawing her attention. She looked up quickly, expecting a request or an instruction, but what she saw in his eyes was different. Richard sat down in the armchair across from her, clasped his hands together, and exhaled slowly. "I need to ask you something," he continued, his tone softer than she had ever heard before. Her expression grew tense, unsure of what was coming, though her heart told her it was important. Oliver, oblivious to the tension, giggled when his tower of blocks collapsed. Maria smiled briefly at him before turning back to Richard. He cleared his throat, clearly struggling with words that did not come naturally to him. "I don't want you to leave," he finally admitted. The sentence hung in the air, heavier than any order he had ever given. Maria's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard. Richard leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, speaking more quickly now, as if afraid he would lose the courage if he stopped. "Not just as an employee. Not just until I find someone else. I mean, stay. Stay as part of this life, with us." His voice broke slightly, but he pressed on. "You've done more for Oliver than I could have imagined, more than I can repay. But I don't want this to be about pay, or contracts, or duties. I want you to belong here, not because of a job, but because we need you, because I need you." His words trembled, but they were honest, and Maria felt them deeply. For a moment, Maria sat frozen, processing what he had just said. She had never expected to hear such words from Richard, the man who had once been cold, distant, and impossible to reach. She felt her throat tighten, her eyes beginning to sting with tears she tried to hold back. Richard continued, his voice steadier now. "I know you've dreamed of studying, of building something for yourself. If you stay, I'll help you with that. Whatever you need, time, resources, support, you'll have it. I don't want you to give up your future just because you're here. I want you to grow, to achieve everything you've dreamed of, but I also want you to do it while being part of this family." His gaze dropped for a second, his pride faltering, before he added in almost a whisper, "I can't do this alone. And I don't want to anymore." The confession, spoken without hesitation this time, broke through every wall he had once built around himself. Maria could see it clearly. He wasn't offering her a job, he was offering her a place in their lives. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to steady her emotions. But Oliver's little hand tugged at her sleeve, making her laugh softly through the tears. She looked back at Richard, her chest full of emotions that words could barely hold. "Richard," she began, her voice shaky but clear, "I don't need a contract. I don't need your last name to belong here." She paused, swallowing hard as the tears kept coming. "From the moment Oliver reached for me, from the moment I decided to stay by his side, I was already part of this family. That hasn't been about money or work or obligations. It's about love and trust, and something I can't put into words. I don't need to be asked to stay because I've never truly planned to leave." Her words came from her heart, simple and true. Richard stared at her, unable to speak at first, but the relief that washed over him was visible in the way his shoulders dropped, the tension in his face melting away. Oliver clapped his hands at the sound of his motherly figure's laughter, oblivious to the depth of what had just been exchanged between the two adults. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on Maria, and for the first time in what felt like years, a real smile spread across his face. Not the polite, forced smile he gave in business meetings, not the thin expression he wore to hide his pain. This was different, warm, unguarded, almost like a man rediscovering something he thought was lost forever. Maria wiped her tears, returning his smile, and the heaviness of the moment gave way to something lighter, something hopeful. In that room, it felt as though a new chapter was beginning, one where Oliver's laughter, Maria's presence, and Richard's acceptance would finally blend into a sense of home. Richard inhaled deeply, letting out a shaky breath. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from relief. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was full, rich with the weight of everything they had just confessed without needing long explanations. Richard stood slowly, walked closer, and crouched beside Oliver, who was now babbling happily as he stacked his blocks again. He looked at his son, then at Maria, and whispered quietly, almost to himself but loud enough for her to hear, "We're not just three people living in the same house anymore." Maria nodded, her eyes still wet but shining with certainty. Richard reached out, brushing Oliver's hair back gently, then looked at Maria once more, his smile still lingering. For the first time, he truly believed that they were no longer surviving day by day in a house filled with silence and grief. They were becoming a family. And in that realization, Richard felt lighter than he had in years, knowing he had not simply asked her to stay. He had finally recognized that she already belonged. The day of Maria's graduation ceremony arrived after years of dedication, study, and balancing responsibilities at home with Oliver. The large hall was filled with rows of chairs, graduates in their gowns, and families waiting with excitement. Maria stood among the students, her cap neatly placed, her eyes glistening with pride, but also humility. She remembered the long nights of studying after putting Oliver to bed, the mornings she woke early to prepare breakfast before leaving for her classes, and the countless times she doubted she would finish. Yet here she was, wearing the gown she once thought belonged only to others. In the audience, Oliver, now older, sat between Richard and a few other relatives. His hands held a cardboard sign he had prepared secretly with Richard's help. The letters were bold, written in colorful markers. "We love you, Mama." As Maria walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Oliver lifted the sign high with both hands, his face shining with joy. Maria froze for a brief second when she saw it, her throat tightening as her eyes watered. She pressed the diploma to her chest and smiled widely. At that moment, she felt her entire journey had been worth every step. Richard stood and applauded, louder than anyone around him, his face openly emotional. He had watched Maria grow from the quiet, uncertain woman who once entered his house as a housemaid into the confident, accomplished woman standing on the stage. His pride was not just for her achievement, but for the life they had built together. Years ago, he had believed their home would always carry silence and grief. But Maria had proven him wrong. He remembered the letter from his wife, the words telling him to let Oliver find love and support in unexpected places. Now, seeing Maria graduate, he knew he had fulfilled that request. She had not only cared for Oliver, but had become his mother in every way that mattered. Richard clapped until his hands stung, his chest full of gratitude and pride. Oliver leaned against his side, smiling brightly, and whispered, "She did it, Dad." Richard nodded, his eyes still fixed on Maria, thinking to himself that she had done far more than just graduate. She had given their family a second chance at life. After the ceremony ended, they all gathered outside. Oliver ran toward Maria with the sign still in his hands, nearly tripping over his own feet in excitement. "Mama!" he called, wrapping his arms around her tightly. Maria knelt down, hugging him back with tears streaming freely down her face. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Thank you, my love." Richard approached slowly, giving them their moment before joining in. When Maria looked up at him, their eyes met, and no words were needed. He simply opened his arms, and she stepped into his embrace, holding Oliver between them. Cameras flashed around them as other families celebrated, but Richard didn't care about any of that. For him, the picture in his mind was enough. Maria holding Oliver, the diploma in her hand, and himself by their side. It was the image of the family he never thought he would have again, whole and strong, not because of perfection, but because of the love they had chosen to nurture. Maria's heart swelled as she realized this was not just her victory, but theirs. Together, they had built something unshakable. When they returned home that evening, the house was alive with laughter and warmth. Oliver, still buzzing with excitement, carried his sign everywhere, proudly showing it to every visitor who came to congratulate Maria. Later, when things calmed down, the three of them settled in the living room. Oliver curled up on the couch and looked at Maria with hopeful eyes. "Mama," he said softly, "can you sing the song?" Maria tilted her head, surprised for a moment, then smiled knowingly. It was the same melody she had sung years ago when Oliver was just a baby, restless in her arms. She nodded, sitting beside him, and began to hum the familiar tune. Her voice was steady, filled with the same warmth it had always carried, but now it was joined by something more, years of memories, struggles, and triumphs that gave the melody deeper meaning. Oliver leaned his head against her shoulder, content and calm, his body relaxing with each note. The house, once marked by grief, now vibrated with the simple beauty of their shared song. Richard, sitting nearby, listened quietly at first. The sound of Maria's voice brought back countless nights when he had stood at the nursery door, afraid to step in, yet unable to walk away. Back then, he had only been a silent witness, but now, after everything they had faced together, he no longer wanted to stay apart. Slowly, he began to hum along, his deep voice blending with hers. Maria glanced at him, surprised, but her smile widened as she continued. Oliver looked between them, his eyes bright, and whispered, "Sing louder, Dad." Richard chuckled and joined fully, his voice unsteady at first but gaining strength. Together, their voices filled the living room, weaving a melody that was no longer just a lullaby. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome. The song that once calmed Oliver in times of fear was now a celebration of family, of unity, of love rediscovered. The night ended with laughter, hugs, and the sound of their song still lingering in the air. Richard leaned back on the couch, his arm around Maria, watching Oliver drift off to sleep with a peaceful smile. He thought about how far they had come, from silence and grief to this moment of harmony. What once had been a house divided by pain was now a home rebuilt by trust, patience, and love. Richard looked at Maria, his hand tightening gently around hers, and whispered, "We're a family. Always." She nodded, resting her head against his shoulder, her heart full. The house, which had once felt empty, now carried life in every corner. There were no more employers and employees, no more walls between them. Only a family that had chosen to stand together, rebuilt not by obligation, but by courage and love. In that home, silence no longer meant sorrow. It had been replaced by music, laughter, and the certainty that they would face every tomorrow side by side. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.